Good evening and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening to one of the most hotly anticipated events of the festival, is Charleston in Peril, which is fitting in view of the fact that the session concerns the implications of global warming. I'd like to thank the sponsors of the event, Summer and Clyde Anderson, for their support of the festival in so very many ways. I'm delighted to welcome the 4 panel members, Jeff Goodell and Susan Crawford, closest to me, Faith Rivers-James on the other side, and Dale Morris, as well as the panel moderator, Henry Smythe, all of whom are highly motivated to address the consequences of climate change. Jeff Goodell is a New York Times best-selling author whose current book, The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet, has been widely praised, very widely praised. Susan Crawford, author of Charleston, Race, Water and the Coming Storm, is clinical professor of law at Harvard Law School. Faith Rivers-James is executive director of South Carolina Coastal Preservation League, and Dale Morris, Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Charleston, has an eminent track record in water management. Henry Smythe, Charleston citizen and distinguished lawyer, who served on the Charleston City Council, the board of the International African American Museum, and several other nonprofit organizations, will steer a conversation during which all the panel members will present their different perspectives on the subject of climate change in relation to Charleston, the Low Country, and beyond. And you must admit we have assembled a very interested and very expert panel. Now, although those perspectives may differ, inevitably, respectful and impactful conversations and the exchange of imaginative ideas on and off the platform are the essence of this festival. I'm going to hand over to Henry Smythe to lead the conversation.
Good evening. We'll start with each of the panel members speaking for a few minutes, and then from there we'll go to questions. And Jeff, would you please lead on?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming here tonight. I was thinking about how I would frame my remarks to start off this conversation, and I thought that it would be most useful to kind of do a big picture very briefly. And I was thinking about the single idea that I really wanted to communicate that I think is really important to grasp when we think about, we're going to talk a lot about sea level rise and flooding and climate change, but I think that the big idea that is for me, most helpful to grasp when we think about this is that our world, our cities, our social and economic and cultural system are built for a climate that no longer exists. And that is a very big idea and with a lot of implications. I think that when we think about climate change, when we think about sea level rise, when we think about extreme heat, all these kinds of things, there's a tendency to think that climate change is like a broken leg. That, yeah, okay, we have problems, things are, there's flooding, there's heat, there's this and that, but if we get ourselves together, if we're good people, we stop burning fossil fuels, which is the main driver of climate change, let me underscore, that everything will go back to normal, that it will be okay, that climate change is a little bit like air pollution. That's what happened with air pollution, right? We had really smoggy cities in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Then we passed Clean Air Act, other things happened. We put catalytic converters on cars. Now the air is clean. Climate change is not like that. Climate change is very different. When you put CO2 into the atmosphere, it stays up there for hundreds or thousands of years. And so the problem with climate change is a problem of accumulated CO2 in the atmosphere, which means that even if we stop now, even if tomorrow we all in the entire world stop burning fossil fuels, went to work on skateboards, and we magically were, carbon saints, we would still have the level of warming that we have. And we're not going back. Someday, in hundreds of years, if we build carbon-sucking machines that can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, perhaps. But for all intents and purposes, what we got now is going to be around for a long time. And that is why every additional ton of CO2 we put into the atmosphere is adding to that hotter world that we're going to be living in for a long time. So I think when we talk about all these solutions and all these issues we're talking about today, we need to really understand that we're preparing for a different world. And it's not just about seawalls, it's about law, it's about food, it's about heat, it's about how we build cities, it's about how we build buildings, it's about where we get our energy, it's about all these kinds of things. And this is a fundamental kind of turning point that we're at. And I just wanted to sort of underscore that as the sort of big picture frame for a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today.
Thank you, Jeff. Susan?
I feel lucky to be here. Charleston's a special place. It's a place where the old and new collide in surprising and sometimes hidden ways. It's a place that's congested and beautiful, and a place that 7 million tourists dream of every year. It's also a place that was shaped by plopping fill on marsh and swamp over centuries. And today, it's a place where the level of water next to the city of Charleston, sea levels are rising here 3 times faster than the rest of the globe. So you're special in all kinds of ways. The burden of the effects of this cataclysmic change that is happening now and will accelerate ferociously in a couple of decades, the burdens of that will be felt disproportionately by Black and low-income residents of Charleston, as they will be felt similarly by the most vulnerable parts of our population up and down the coasts. So that's one big idea. There's an old joke about Charleston. How many Charlestonians does it take to change a light bulb? Answer, change. Right. Science here is really strong, and Dale Morris, to his great credit with the city, has been working with the Goodell Climate Center on all of this. We'll see 18 inches at least by 2050. As Jeff says, we're just at the beginning of visible change, but it will keep going and accelerate. 2080, 2.5 feet, with a non-zero, really quite substantial risk of an additional foot or 2 because the West Antarctic is melting so rapidly. And so there's sea level rise. Also, we know that in 2050, there will be intense rainstorms falling here that will bring 13 inches or more of rain and will cover most of the county of Charleston. And we know that Dale has told the City Council that there will be 150 days a year of 8-foot flooding in all the tidal regions of Charleston, not just the peninsula. We also know that as the waters rise, the groundwater goes up too. And you'll start seeing the groundwater intersecting with the surface of what we walk on. Dale just pointed the City Council to this the other day. Right next to the Jasper, water from groundwater rising was right there. The problem with that is that when those huge rainstorms hit, the water won't have anywhere to go, nowhere to drain. So that's, just imagine in just a couple of decades, sort of weekly flooding, heavy rainstorms, what to do. So the book centers the voices of Black residents of Charleston in telling the story of what these effects are likely to bring and how it has felt so far in the planning. I have 4 huge suggestions. In an ideal world, the first step would be to do no harm, to just stop development and not bring more people to the risk of living here. The second would be to amp up disclosures substantially so that people coming here knew what was likely to happen. The city knows what's ahead, and it includes extreme heat as well as very rapidly accelerating sea level rise. The third would be to protect the most vulnerable among us, to really focus efforts on that, and the city, to its credit, is really trying to do that. But the fourth is difficult, and it's one we have cognitive trouble with. We have to keep the idea of planned relocation or managed retreat on the table as one of the options for Charleston, as it is or should be for all cities along the coast. Look, as human beings, we have difficulty even anticipating thinking about our own death in a matter of decades. It's very difficult for us to think about the decade timescales of what's happening in Charleston and will be happening everywhere in our world. But as Jeff says, we're leaving the climate we once knew. We are going ever forward into something dramatically different. We don't think of McKinsey as the most empathetic consulting group, but here's a quote from them just yesterday. Adaptation, and that's the subject of all this, will require an unprecedented level of cooperation in a spirit of equity and with a deep understanding of the interrelated destiny of all members of the human family. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Faith?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for having me. I'm Faith Rivers James, and I head up the Coastal Conservation League. And I will tell you that I am a native of Charleston, the first to head up this organization that is a native Charlestonian. And this is a city and a place that I love. And I've had the opportunity to now live on land that's been in my family since the 1870s. And so the thought of retreating is very hard to manage. But in the meantime, between now and whenever the waters rise, the League has been focused on how do we navigate where we are now? How do we prepare? How do we adapt? And so we've done things like work in partnership with the city on the slab on grade, to not build slab houses where you have consistent flooding. We're focusing on beach renourishment. We all enjoy our beaches, but then that sand goes out somewhere and it comes back in another form. And so we try to focus on nature-based solutions for those as opposed to hardscapes. But then we look at our marshes and our floods, because it's not just about us, the humans, right? And I found one of the, Jeff's book very interesting. When you tell the story of the things that don't have voice, that are trying to navigate, we've got to leave space for them too. And so our marshes are the home site, right, for our migrating seabirds. And so we've got to figure out a way to protect them so that they're here for generations, whether we're here or not. And then finally, looking at how we work with infrastructure. Infrastructure was a privilege when I was growing up. I grew up in Mount Pleasant. It was just east of the Cooper then, a rural community. There wasn't a whole lot of water and sewer lines going through Mount Pleasant. And now we've got to figure out, well, without that infrastructure, what do? We have a lot of land on the coast that is owned by the descendants of freed slaves who purchased property in those former plantations. And so when we talk about infrastructure and equity, our organization has to take a second look. We've got to figure out, how do we spend that money? What do? How do we enable people to stay on their home sites without infrastructure? Because as the water tables rise, so does the septic level and the water lines. And so unless we all are going to become city dwellers, we've got to figure out something with septic and water infrastructure, and then look at the equity of those. And so I just look forward to the conversation tonight and hearing from you all about how we can all manage this adaptation together.
Thank you, Faye. Dale?
Thank you. It's a distinct honor to be on this panel, and I just thank everyone for coming tonight. So I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Charleston. I have worked in this realm for 20 plus years, not in the city. Been here for 2.5 years trying to figure this spot out. My job, as I described to the mayor, is how do we stay here? And if you listen to Jeff and Susan and Faith, I think I probably should submit my resignation, right? So this is hard stuff. This is really hard stuff. And the idea of this adaptation requiring collaboration and cooperation, thinking about retreat and what that means. We are undertaking a comprehensive water plan right now. It's 2/3 of the way done. We have the mapping done. We have identified, we will show these maps soon, there will be areas of retreat in Charleston, and let's just be clear about it. Doesn't have to be nasty retreat. It can be managed retreat. We can help those who need help to get out of here, get out of those spots, but there are spots in Charleston too that are high ground, relative high ground, and we can retreat there. So you don't have to abandon Charleston. You don't have to move to Columbia, to the fall line. That's where the Atlantic Ocean used to be in geologic time. It used to be the fall line in Columbia, right? So it may get there again, but not in our lifetimes. Sea level rise is really the existential challenge here. The city did a vulnerability analysis in 2019, a very good one. The highest risk to the city of Charleston is storm surge. Storm surge doesn't occur that often. It occurs with hurricanes and tropical storms. But when it happens, it is ugly. Think of Hurricane Katrina, you think of Hurricane Hugo here, you can think of Hurricane Harvey, which is a rain bomb with some hurricane winds in it. You can think of Superstorm Sandy, which wasn't a hurricane. Y'all experienced Ian last year, that was a tropical storm and drove a lot of storm surge at us, but not here, just north of us. We got lucky. We had a 10.7 mean level water surge coming at us, and the storm veered to the north and saved us. So we have storm surge as our highest risk. We have floodplain inundation as our second risk, and that's from rainfall as well as from creeping tides. Susan's right. I'm convinced that groundwater flooding is occurring here. I found evidence of it next to the Jasper last week when the tidal flood, we had the last word of king tide last Tuesday, 10 days ago. It's happening, and what that means is the rain that falls has nowhere to go except in the streets and in your cars and in your homes. There is high ground in the city of Charleston, so again, it's not a disastrous situation, but it's something we have to manage. Sea level rise, let's talk about this. On the peninsula in Charleston, we measure tidal floods, minor, moderate, and major. 7-foot mean low water, 7.5 mean low water, and 8. In the 1960s, we had 5 minor tidal floods a year. In the 1980s, we had 9. In the 2000s, we had 21. In between 2015 and 2022, we had 59 of those a year. We're going to have 75 or more this year. For moderate tidal flooding, that's my cheat sheet here, we used to have 1 a year. And in the 2000s, in the 1980s, a little over 1 a year on average. In the 2000s, it was over 4 a year. 2015 and onwards, it was 17 a year, and this year we're going to have 30. Major tidal flooding, this is now disruptive. This is when cars can't get down streets and some people's houses are flooding because the wind is driving the water over the top of the land water edge. It's not coming up from underneath, it's coming over the land water edge. The west side is very vulnerable on the peninsula, and the east side up by Newmarket Creek, by Morrison Yard, is very vulnerable. It's very low. These are tidal creeks that were filled in, and now we have this challenge. So we had none in the 1960s, major tidal flooding. 3 total in the 1980s, so one every 3 years. 1 total in the 2000s. We had 4 a year beginning in 2015, and this year we're going to have 7. That is sea level rise, and it is driving everything we have to think about. So Susan is right. The city has adopted 14 inches. This is the last NOAA technical report from March 2022. We have adopted 14 inches of sea level rise as our planning horizon for 2050 and 2 to 4 feet by 2070, 2080. Cities do not plan that far ahead. There is no city in the United States that is planning that far ahead. We have to spend dollars carefully and wisely. We need to use the best available science we have, but it's really difficult for us to think out to 2070. Because if you go back 50 years now, where was the city then, right? This is a really hard time for city council that is elected every 4 years to allocate scarce resources to these things if there's uncertainty associated with it. But there is uncertainty, but we can see the trend. I worked with the Dutch for many years, and I'm going to wrap up here. I worked for the Dutch for many years. They look at integrated flood risk management and land use planning and legal structures to keep safe, to keep their feet dry. They do not do single-purpose infrastructure. They communicate the risk expressly to their citizens, and they try to squeeze every dollar they can from the infrastructure, the money they spend on infrastructure, to get multiple benefits from it. So not just flood risk, but recreation, mobility, aesthetics, environmental justice, they do these things. It is what we're trying to do here now in the city of Charleston. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. We have no other choice if we want to stay here. So there you go.
Thanks, Dale. Leaving the peninsula and going broader, due to the efforts of the Coastal Conservation League and various land trusts and so forth, about 1.2 million acres of marsh and land in the Low Country have been preserved, and that undoubtedly is going to be a help. Faith, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Environmental ecosystems provide us with many, many benefits, often, and they're often resilient over time. What ecosystems in the Low Country are most at risk, and what community benefits might be lost due to climate impacts?
Right. Well, thank you. Certainly, our marshes are critically important for several reasons. They serve as a big sponge, and so it's a place that will hold a lot of water. And the more that we fill those marshes, the less ability we have to absorb water when there's extra water coming down. And so the marshes are critically important, and we have to protect that ecosystem. Now, the beauty of the conservation work in this area is that some of that land can be set aside to allow for marsh migration. You would enable a family to take those tax benefits, or it just might meet their family's ethic to say, we want this land to stay in a pristine state. And also the Conservation Bank has the ability to purchase land so that it can allow marsh to migrate. And so I think that is an important feature of our Low Country work. I think the other part, though, is that we not only look at the marsh for absorption of water, but for what lives in the marsh. And so earlier I was talking about these seabirds. Crab Bank out in the harbor. It was a great project for us to work with the Corps of Engineers in the port, and we were able to basically renourish Crab Bank so that seabirds can roost there. Same thing with DeVoe. But on our most recent storm, Adalia, a third of DeVoe Bank is now tidal. And if it's tidal, the birds can't nest there. 40% of the brown pelicans in our country nest at DeVoe. And if they will have less space. Now, why is it so important? They need space where coyotes cannot go. And so our sea islands or these inlets and hammocks provide that essential territory for these creatures to nest and to survive. And so that is a big part of the work that we do at the League to try to protect our wildlife. If we don't do it, we lose features that are just not wonderful to enjoy. They're a big part of our ecosystem. And so if we want to continue to have life as it is for us and those creatures, the stories of the polar bears, in the book, they seem so sweet and friendly. Right? And, perhaps, the long-eared bat is not beautiful, but it deserves to live too. And so we are working hard to be sure that both the water-based creatures, but also things that live in our special forests, we have several pristine areas that our state has preserved. And thank goodness we have a government that is focused on some natural land preservation. But the Francis Marion Forest, the Cape Romaine, Lewis Ocean Bay in our north coast, they provide the opportunity to grow things like Venus flytraps that you can't find in other places. And so if we don't protect those natural areas, we will lose all of those assets. And none of us wants our kids to grow up in a place where they've never seen a polar bear anywhere, or that we lose creatures that are part of the natural system. It will become a very different place without those birds and without the ability to get to that marsh.
Thank you, Faith. Jeff, these last summers in Europe and in the U.S., just getting hotter and hotter, are there thresholds that we need to be monitoring and should be, and are there levels beyond which we can't go or that we need to prevent getting there, other than no more cars? But how do we keep score as time goes by?
So do you mean in the context of heat?
Yes, I'm sorry, absolutely.
So the book that I wrote most recently, The Heat Will Kill You First, is about extreme heat. But I want to say that that book grew out of a book that I wrote about sea level rise called The Water Will Come about 6 years ago. And that first introduced me to Charleston and to a lot of these issues that we're talking about today. And one of the interesting things about the difference of thinking about sea level rise versus impacts of extreme heat is sea level rise is, as we're all talking about, is slow moving but constant. It's about long-term thinking. It's about infrastructure. It's about property value. No one is going to, stand on the beach and drown because, a glacier just collapsed in Antarctica, right? That's not going to happen in real time, right? It's about the accumulation of these rising waters and these that punctuate these major events like storm surges and things. Heat is very different. Thinking about extreme heat is about something that will kill you. I mean, the book was born for me in a day in Phoenix when I was late to a meeting downtown and I tried to run 20 blocks in 115-degree weather. And I just about passed out and my heart was pounding and I was like, oh my God, if I had to go another 15 blocks, would I make it? And sounds ordinary, but for me, it was a striking thing because I'd been a writer about climate change for almost 20 years, and heat is hardly a secret. But I never thought of it as a real active force that could kill you very quickly. And so the heat book is much more about mortality, about how it can kill you. And it's very different than the sea level rise book. As far as the idea of limits and thresholds, one of the things that I talk about in the book that is, I think, a very useful concept is this idea of a Goldilocks zone that comes from looking for life on other planets. They look for the presence of liquid water. If it's too cold, it's ice. If it's too hot, it's vaporized like Venus. They look for the not too hot, not too cold place where there's liquid water. Well, human beings and every other living thing have evolved in a certain kind of Goldilocks zone where we're really good at keeping our temperatures and regulating our temperatures in this particular zone. We sweat, we do all the things that we can do. But then as the temperature gets hotter and hotter, then we go outside of that Goldilocks zone and we get into temperature ranges that we can't handle. And even if we're sweating, even if we're drinking water, all those kinds of things, there are limits to where human survivability. And, there's basic kind of, it's a very complex formula because it depends on humidity. As you all know here, humid heat is much more difficult to deal with than dry heat because your skin doesn't, the sweat doesn't evaporate. Depends on whether you're exercising and all that. But there are thresholds where if you get too hot, you and me and every dragonfly and every shark and every redwood tree will die. It will kill you. And where exactly your vulnerability is depends on your age, how good your heart is, all kinds of different things. But there are thresholds, and it is a very real thing that there are parts of the world and parts of America that in certain times of the year will be uninhabitable for all intents and purposes. And as it gets hotter and hotter, there will be more of that. And just to wrap this up, this will have profound changes on lots of things. First of all, the equity issues that we're talking about here are really important in this also because a lot of you in this room, I'm sure, have air conditioning. I've been on a book tour for this book. Everyone says, well, yeah, it's hot. I don't want to go for a jog at noon on a hot day, but I just sit in my house and turn up the air conditioning. Well, you're lucky, but this is a sort of bubble of reality, right? There are billions of people on the planet who do not have air conditioning and will never have access to air conditioning. We're not going to air condition the fields we grow our crops in. We're not going to air condition the oceans. Air conditioning is not a fix for all this. And it's also going to have just these small changes in temperature are having big economic impacts because people can't work outside. I live in Texas. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, hardly a sort of left-wing tree hugger organization, just did a study. We had a heat wave in Texas this summer, 40 days above 102 degrees. And they calculated it cost the state $27 billion in lost economic revenue because every food truck was shut down, people couldn't work, people didn't want to go to work, the health effects of people going to the hospital. So these are all these sort of knock-on effects that you don't really think about when we think about more and more hotter days. Just like you were talking about more and more rising water, if you think about it individually, you think, oh, I can deal with that. But when you think about this accumulated weight and this acceleration that Susan was talking about, that as this stuff is not moving in a linear way, it's going to move in a kind of exponential way. And so you think it's hot in Charleston in the summer? Just wait.
Thank you, Jeff. Susan, in your book, you mentioned that Charleston, like a lot of other cities, rely on property taxes to fund the government and get things done. Why is that a problem? And in terms of what we're talking about here tonight.
Thanks for that. And look, every system in every level of our government is set up to keep the status quo in place. And one of the things that does that is that most cities in the United States have to rely on property tax to provide services, make sure there's a policeman, make sure that schools are working, everything rides on that. That means that cities like Charleston are really stuck in this spiral of feeling the need to encourage additional growth. So at the same time, looking for federal funding to adapt to sea level rise, also encouraging growth. At the end of the street where that groundwater was, next to the Jasper on Broad Street, 19 luxury townhomes, $3 million each. Not yet built, but going to show up. There are reasons, fiscal reasons for that. What I'm worried about in this whole systemic approach to adaptation is that cities are genuinely stuck, and in order to raise debt to be able to fund the kinds of fixes and infrastructure they want to build, they'll be looking to property tax and home values to guarantee that debt. That's what stands behind municipal bonds. Coastal real estate in the United States is overvalued to the tune of $200 billion right now because the sea level risks have not been taken on board by Fannie Mae or the banks yet. They will be. The insurance markets are already getting this. So what's the city to do? They have to protect their people, they have to come up with revenue, but by encouraging growth, they are expanding the number of people that then they feel they need to serve. And as things get worse, likely richer people will be able to leave, leaving cities with a pretty desperate situation. It may take a series of municipal bankruptcies. I'm not saying that Charleston will be one of them, but that's going to happen along the coast as this spiral sort of reaches its end, having to keep infrastructure going without the valuations behind it to raise the money to fix things. So this is a huge economic issue. It would be cheaper, frankly, to plan ahead for a gradual decommissioning of infrastructure rather than to go on with this spiral of encouraging more people to live here. It's called a moral hazard, sort of saying that this is relatively safe, you could be here, encourages greater growth, which gets the city in this stuck spiral. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. Dale, as the Chief Resilience Officer for the city for the last, I think, 2.5 years, but before that, 27 years of experience with the Dutch dialogues. What has the city of Charleston done so far with regard to heat and rising water?
Right, so thank you for that. So I mentioned our vulnerability analysis, storm surge, floodplain inundation, earthquake is our third.
Oh, yeah.
So we have that fault line nearby us, so that's not so great. And then heat is our fourth. So we're trying to deal with the water problems first, but we have done some work on heat, and I'll just describe that. So in 2020, the medical district wanted to, what's going on with the patients who are walking from the car to the doctor's office and between the hospitals? And they just installed some green space there, and they closed down, B Street in spots. They did some measurements, and they realized it wasn't as cool as they thought it was, that new Green Street, because it was AstroTurf. And certain materials on the buildings were actually hotter than others, and so they didn't think of materials when they were designing spots, right? So they want to understand what that meant, so they got some good data, and they said, okay, we're gonna have to start to change this, right? So these kind of places, the medical district in the city and big developments, this is long-term planning. So how do we adjust for that? So that's underway. A year later, with the city and others, they put heat monitors on the workers as they went through their day in July for a month, and they caught all kind of data, and now they've changed their work schedules for the employees. And that's okay for some employees who get to go home and live in air conditioning, but there are probably some employees who may not have air conditioning. And because it doesn't get cool at night in Charleston, they are now accumulating this risk. If you can cool down at night and take a cold shower, you're okay, your body's resilient, but if you can't, it accumulates, and then it's deadly. The city then worked through a process called a heat watch, and and there's some members of the audience that participated in this. They drove around morning, noon, and the evening and measured temperatures all through transects around the city to see what was going on. How did heat manifest throughout the course of the day, and when was it worse, and when was it manageable? So really good information for planning and infrastructure planning, and where we live and where our tree cover is. And the city then went through a process. We overlaid that heat data with our tree canopy, the tree canopy survey to figure out trees are really good for a lot of things. They suck up stormwater, but they also reduce heat. So where does that look, and where are the hot spots in the city? Where are the bald spots in the city? And the Charleston Housing Authority is going through a complete redevelopment of all of their properties over the next decade. We worked with NOAA, and we were part of a NOAA process here with Phoenix, Miami, and Las Vegas to do research with NOAA on the Gadsden Green community. So this is a public housing area. It's going to be redeveloped. They have flood risks. They have this heat risk, low-income people, a lot of vulnerabilities. What do we do? What can we learn from this process so that as the Housing Authority redevelops that, they orient the buildings to wind, and they use materials that will reduce heat, and that the area can be safe. So this is a little pilot, but we're doing that. On water, so we need to thank. I'm here because the city of Charleston is in the game. We are in the game. We are far further ahead than most coastal cities on the Atlantic coast in the United States. You can take pride that your mayor and your city council has funded those things, and you have dedicated city staff that are doing those things. The question I ask all the time is, are we doing enough? Okay, and I don't have an answer for that. We have rehabilitated the low battery. We have almost finished with the Spring Fishburne Deep Tunnel system. We're doing natural nature-based features over in Shadow Moss, where 32 townhomes were bought out because of repetitive flooding. We're doing a natural nature-based project on Johns Island. We have the Concord Pump Station upgrade, the Earhart Drop Shaft Tunnel. I can go on and on and on. These are all captured on the city's flooding and sea level rise strategy. We're doing a lot of work. And you know what? None of this is free. The dollars that are needed for this come from property taxes, but they also come from business license and business fees, and all those 7 and 8 million tourists now, 8 million, they're spending money here at our restaurants. Why do you think those restaurants are here? Because they have good clients. So we have to manage all of those things, right? And the workers in the medical district is the single largest destination for employment in the state of South Carolina. There's 25,000 jobs there. There's no other denser spot for employment in the state of South Carolina than the medical district. And guess what? It has huge flood risk. Okay, so if we lose those areas, if we lose these places that are paying property taxes and business fees and all that, we will lose the ability, and this is what Susan is getting at, to fund police and fire and drainage across the city. So we have to protect, and this is a Dutch thing, you protect what matters most, and it isn't that a house south of Broad matters more than a house in West Ashley or Johns Island. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is if we know that the peninsula is the place of the city that funds the largest portion of the city budget, we need to invest there. We need to prioritize that. It doesn't mean we also don't have to do work in those other neighbors, in those other parts of the city. So we have to chew gum and walk at the same time. This is hard stuff. But the reason I'm here, and it's not important that I'm here, but the reason I'm here is because Charleston is struggling with this fight. And it is using all the resources it has to do this. There are places that are too complex, like New York and Miami. The politics are hard. Big cities are hard to manage. We're not that. And they have wicked problems. Miami is probably unsalvageable over the next 30 or 40 years because the limestone that is their subsurface, because the water's just going to come up. You can build all the stuff you want to protect the storm surge, and the water's just going to come up underneath, right? That's limestone. That's a physical condition. New York, all that complexity in New York, New Jersey, the boroughs, it's just impossible to do stuff up there. And we're also not like some other coastal cities that are small, that doesn't have resources to fuss around with this stuff. So we're in the game, we're trying. I don't know if we'll be successful, but we're going to try and we're going to do our best. And so the city is doing a lot. I speak around the nation because people understand, they recognize what Charleston is doing. And we haven't figured it out, but we are working at it. So we're in some ways we're a pilot, we're a beacon, we're a petri dish to try to figure this stuff out.
I think Dale was a great hire for the city. Faith, speaking of governments being difficult, the Coastal Conservation League, the cross-jurisdiction climate collaborations are surely needed, and you all are active in all these various counties. And these are often complicated, time-consuming, and not valued by the voters. What is the Coastal Conservation League climate adaptation advice for the multiple municipal governments across the Lowcountry?
Well, I think it's twofold. One is to first recognize the problem. Now, we believe everyone in this room, if you didn't believe something was different about the climate, you probably wouldn't be here. But we also have to recognize that as we go through development, that things have changed. And so this spring, many of us were out on the pier terminal expressing our concerns that, if we're supposed to do no harm first, then we shouldn't put buildings on a seawall. And so, we can chew gum and walk at the same time, but we can't look forward and backward at the same time. And so we need to, acknowledge things are going to be different, and we can't keep doing what we've done. Dale had a great quote in the newspaper last week. What do we do with entitlements, right? We get these planned developments, they are granted rights, and then conditions change. And so at least before we hand out those rights, let's be sure that we're all rowing in the same direction or not rowing people out of water once they're there. But I think in terms of collaboration, the city government, the county government, and the state, it is essential that all of us recognize that we might have come in different boats, but it'd come in different ships, but we're in the same boat now. If we don't collaborate, we're not going to be able to navigate our way out of this crisis. And so I think, the competition between jurisdictions, overgrowth, and where it goes, we have to have a regional approach. We are, trying to enforce and maintain our urban growth boundary. Now, traditionally, we've done that by denying infrastructure, because we know that if you build the water and sewer line, the growth will come. But that's led to consequences for people who are living there who need access to clean water. And so perhaps if we say there's an urban growth boundary, we keep it, regardless of whether there's a water or sewer line going out to that community. So I think it really is a sort of a come to the water moment to understand that we've all got to figure out how to get out of this bowl. That's easier said than done, but it also gives us, I think, hope. I wish we had 1,000 Dales working for the city, but we also have to think through, as we present these ideas, we've got to remember that everybody isn't just coming to Charleston. Many of us are from here, want to be here, want to stay here. And when we have a policy for development that ties infrastructure to new growth and new development, it means that all the infrastructure goes to the new folks and nothing's left for the old folks. And when we talk about defending the peninsula, the wall is important, but it is also important to have something beyond buyouts for the rest of the tidal areas that are going to be in trouble. And so I think it's important for government to recognize that, yes, we have a tax base, we need to maintain that, but we also have to recognize just the human connection to land. If in in 50 years, if none of my descendants and relatives are here, that's one thing. But while we're here now, can there be some equitable distribution of our strategies to hold off the harm? And governments have to work together to get to that point.
Thanks. Dale, are we stuck with addressing heat city by city, or is there an opportunity there to have a national?
I think you meant Jeff.
I'm sorry, I do mean Jeff.
Dale, you can take it.
Sorry. You guys look a lot alike.
I have
They both have
different color hair.
noses. I mean,
Can we get to a national extreme heat policy, or is that too far in the future, or can we?
Well, yeah, we can. And, when you're talking about city and state and county coming together, we also need federal policy to come together broadly on all this stuff, right? And, when you have a president who says that climate change is a Chinese hoax, that does not help, right? And so you need everybody working together on this, whether it's on sea level rise or on heat. But, heat is very different than sea level rise. In a certain way, heat is easier to deal with because, yes, we have to rethink our cities, how they're designed. Yes, we have to plant more urban trees. We have to have more access for cooling for people who don't have it. We have to figure out, air conditioning is its own nightmare, as I suggested, but access to air conditioning and cool spaces is really important. But it's pretty easy to save people's lives from extreme heat. Simple things like how we talk about it, how we message about it. Think about the messaging that happens here from emergency services and from public officials and from friends and everybody else when there's a storm coming. Everybody knows what to do. Everybody knows it's a really bad storm. Everyone knows evacuation routes. You guys all are very savvy about how to deal with that. Heat is totally different, right? First of all, you can't see it. It's invisible. You look out the window, you can't tell if it's 70 degrees or 120 degrees. We have no visual things. You turn on the TV, they talk about a heat wave, and they show people at the beach. They think, oh, better beach weather. How nice. How fun. There's no rating system. There's no, Category 1 heat wave, Category 2 heat wave. In my book, I talk about idea of naming heat waves, the way that we name tropical storms. And some people joke that they should be named, in Italy they've named them heat wave Lucifer, and some people have suggested it should be heat wave Exxon Mobil or something like that. But there's a lot of really simple things that you can do to save lives in heat waves. Heat kills far more people than any other climate disaster, way more than storms or hurricanes, droughts, anything like that. But it's also, we're not talking about having to elevate, ancient buildings, and we're not talking about having to change the fundamental infrastructure overnight to deal with heat. It's simply a message of kind of thinking differently about it, getting more people aware of the risks, to be unlike me when I was in Phoenix and thinking, what is happening to me? Why is my heart pounding, and why am I about to pass out, and why is heat dangerous? So there's a lot of simple, just educational stuff to do around heat that is very different than the sea level rise question, which really costs a lot of money and has all of these questions of access to infrastructure and these fundamental changes that, so in a way, heat is also, it's easier to be kind of optimistic in a way about dealing with it because it doesn't require billions of dollars. It just requires a shift in consciousness.
Thank you. Susan, have I got that right?
Yes, that's me.
I want to talk about managed retreat from the coast, but as part of that, please include the difficulty of planning for the future. It's one thing to plan for the next 5 years, but what we're talking about is decades down the road in some cases. And so how do we deal with that?
It's not that far away. Our lives are brief. This is it's planning for lifetimes is really what we need to be doing now, and we're not thinking of it that way. We don't have a national heat plan. We also, although it's part of the Paris Accords, we don't have a national adaptation plan. It's us and India. We just never did it. And so we have never set priorities, figured out where the money's going to come from, decided what level of sea level rise the government affirmatively says is coming. NOAA says, pick your level. And then all the cities have to go off and hire consultants to get advice about what's about to happen. So we have a lot of coordination and planning to do on the federal level, even with this administration, frankly, that would, if we were wise, we would sort of set a time T now and say what level of risk was acceptable for human lives along the coast, because this is about protecting people. And then we'd say, at time T now, we're going to buy out the people who voluntarily want to leave at their home value now. We're going to say, in 20 years, this infrastructure along the coast will be decommissioned, things like roads, electricity, power, sewage. And so the window of time will be limited. I know this sounds unthinkable, but if we were wise, we would help each other through what is going to be a grieving, painful process of loosening attachment while keeping communities whole, to the extent they want to stay whole. There's a huge number of people thinking about this as community-based relocation efforts. But so far, all those people are talking about it. Federal government and the levers of power and money and staff are not attaching to that conversation, and no priorities are being set. And we have no clear statement from the government of this risk and not more, and that needs to happen. So I'm hoping that this last bit of this next Biden administration will be very excited about having someone wake up in the morning every day and say, we have to be planning for heat and for water because our economic stability depends on this. Our civilization, as Jeff said, was built on the assumption of a stable climate. Our banking system, our institutions, everything. That's gone. And so we need to be really looking forward through our lifetimes to establish a plan that will help people with dignity and respect think through what is likely to be a really miserable transition.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, we do have somebody who wakes up every morning and thinks about what we need to be doing. And please tell us what the city needs to do.
So let me ponder that. I just want to, there's some things here that just to pass by I want to reference. So this issue of entitlements, there's a good article about this last week in the Post and Courier. So we're all frustrated. So let me back up here. 2015, it's not that long ago. That's a trigger. That's a moment when climate change became undeniable for a lot of people in the United States. 2015, it's not that long ago. It wasn't Hurricane Katrina, that was that the case for New Orleans, and Sandy in New York, was that the trigger? No, 2015. Because that's when the rain started to come down in buckets in small spaces. The Atlas 14 that NOAA uses to predict, rainfall over 24 hours that everyone uses for planning became unreliable. We had the 1,000-year rainfall here in Charleston, 4 days. I wasn't here, but I read about it, and it didn't look like it was nice. Then we had Matthew and Irma and Dorian and Joaquin and all these girlfriends and boyfriends that come along. And remember, those were misses. They did not hit Charleston, but they had impacts, right? So, okay. And we haven't been hit for 30 years, or we do. That's what NOAA tells us we're sort of due, so let's keep this in mind. But these entitlements, 2015, a lot of the stuff that is being built now was entitled pre-2015. So there are projects that are underway that developers have the right to develop. Let's keep that in mind. The city entitled them, gave them a right to develop 400 homes in this spot, in this way. And so if the city wants to claw them back, we are liable for the financial depreciation that clawback would cause. A city council member is trying to allocate scarce resources to a lot of different things. Does he want to spend another $20 million or $15 million? And these are numbers that are real, I'm telling you, to buy out a developer because we don't want to build 400. How do you manage that? So this issue of entitlements, it'll perfect itself because now we are, with our comp plan and our zoning ordinance, which is coming along, that's something we're doing and need to do better at, zoning ordinance rewrite, we will stop this unwise development. And it's not that the developers are pernicious, it's just that they're trying to make their money and they know people want to live here. But we have to manage that. We have to set those guidelines. And again, comp plan passed in 2021 sets land and water elevation as the primary consideration for how and where we develop. We're ripping out our zoning ordinance, which dates from 1964, has been amended and amended. We're ripping out and starting over, and we will use land and water elevation as the primary organizing principle for what we do going forward. So we're working at that. So that's something. Heat. In the city of Charleston, we have a strategy, or we have a process, and when it gets too hot for the horses, they stop. But we don't take, and that's great, right? It's great, but we don't take that for the outdoor workers. And I have a colleague who used to work on top at a bar top here in Charleston who worked on a rooftop bar, and it must have been 125 degrees up there, and there was no consideration for that. So we need to figure that human aspect of heat out too. So there's the thing. So what we need to do, we need to understand our vulnerabilities, and we do, but we need to communicate them better. That's my job, that's the mayor's job, that's city's council job, because these risks are very real. This feels like, paradise. There are a lot of challenges here, right? So let's be honest about it, and let's communicate these risks to the people. The sea level rise strategy, it's available online, go look at it, you'll see what the risks are, and then see what we're doing about it. And then y'all can make your own sort of decisions if that's good enough, or you want to pay more taxes to do that. No one wants to pay more taxes, but the stuff we're doing is not free. So let's just keep that in mind. 2, there is no doubt, if any of you know me, the Charleston Peninsula is a crown jewel, it's a gem. The Dutch have looked at it, said you had better protect that spot because it is what makes a lot of things possible. It's the largest historic district in the nation. It's wonderful architecture, it's got all these great things. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but this is a really important place. Storm surge will eat it up. If we get hit by a hurricane, it will eat it up. Because remember, we've had 6 or 7 inches of sea level rise since Hurricane Hugo, and Hurricane Hugo was a miss for Charleston. It crossed over Sullivan's Island, and all the storm surge manifests on the northeast side of a storm. So McClellanville and Georgetown had 18 or 19 feet of sea level of storm surge. Not the 12.5 we had here in Charleston. So it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been. So let's think about how we manage that process with the Army Corps of Engineers, and that's my job. And we are going to get at stormwater flooding and tidal flooding and storm surge flooding within this. That is my mission, so let's be clear. We have to continue to help the people in West Ashley, in Forest Acres. That sea level rise, a lot of the drainage off Peninsula is through gravity. So it's coming off the streets into little drainage catchments, and it's dropping into a ditch somewhere, and it's going out through someone's backyard and getting to the tidal creeks. Well, guess what? 13 inches of measured sea level rise in the last 100 years. Most of those ditches are old. That means the tailwater, where the water comes out of the ditch and tries to get into the tidal creek or into the river and into the ocean, there is not enough space there. So the water isn't getting out, so it's backing up into the neighborhoods. There are numerous communities that have this condition underway with their drainage systems. We need to clean those ditches, and they haven't been maintained for a long time. This mayor and this city council have funded a process to clean up these ditches, a 5-year strategy to get them out. We need to fund that. And we need to pay, this is something that's going on not just in Charleston. So we have 7 crews that are authorized, city council, that drive around the vacuum trucks that suck out the stuff from the drains, right, to keep the drains clean. We have 7 authorized crew. We have staff for 3. It's not that the city isn't trying to hire that staff. It's that the city's salary isn't high enough to pay that staff because the private sector is paying more. And if you're a working man or working woman and you have 2 mouths to feed and you're trying to live a good life, you go where the money's better. That's a fact of life. That's a labor market condition, and it's going on. Our engineering department is understaffed, not because we're not trying to fill those positions, because the private sector is paying 30, 25, 30, 40% more. So we don't have the staff to do that. That is going to require, when I say nothing, I'm an economist if you haven't figured it out yet. Nothing is free. We're going to have to pay money to do this, or we're going to have to pay the consequences of not doing it. And it's more expensive. Reaction is more expensive than preparation and protection. That's a fact. So there's a whole bunch of things we have to do. Faith is talking about allowing space for these marshes to grow. We had a very successful project right after I got here, and thank goodness I was privileged to be part of it. We stopped the development in John's Island in a tidal creek, stopped 400 homes from going into a low-lying area. That's great for the marsh, but you know it's also great? It means that 400 people didn't buy homes that in 20 years from now are going to be underwater. Because what's most people's largest financial asset? It's the equity in their house. So we need to do that. We have a few of those more underway. We have developers trying to help us manage this. So again, the developers aren't bad, but they're trying to make their money, but we're working through that. There's a whole bunch of stuff we need to do. It's green, it's gray, it's hybrid infrastructure, it's natural and nature-based features, it's infrastructure, it's land use planning, it is zoning, and it is communicating to people that not everything is salvageable and the status quo is deadly.
Thank you, Dave. I can't tell whether it's Q&A time because I can't.
Yes, it is.
Okay. I can't see. So we're going to have questions and answers. There are people with mics circulating in the room. I can hardly see a hand go up, but you're not going to get called on if you don't have a hand up.
Thank you all for a fantastic talk. I have a question primarily for Susan and Jeff I'm interested in the intersection of adaptation and mitigation. And when you see a tipping point where the economics of the cost of infrastructure needed to adapt or relocate will be so great that there will be more political will to to decarbonize, but also to have the burden borne by polluters, frankly, so that it's something other than just individual homeowners. Do you see any intersection points that are helpful?
I'm interested in what Jeff's going to say to this, so I'll go first and briefly. We now spend 97% of money around the world when it goes to climate is going to mitigation. Just 3% is going to adaptation. So it's not that there's some equivalency here at the moment. For me, it's a both and situation. We need to be doing everything we can on mitigation, full speed ahead, while recognizing that, as Jeff says, these changes are already baked in and will be accelerating for centuries, if not thousands of years. So we have to help people get through this and lead thriving lives. I think we have an obligation to do that. So for me, the economics actually drive towards enormous additional amounts, you're not going to like this, of public funding, because it's the government that makes sure we have clean air and clean water. This is too big a challenge to be put on the shoulders of individual homeowners. This is why we have governments, to protect us, to keep us safe in times of peril. So we're going to have a shift in thinking about spending being done to protect people and take them through what will be a little bit like hospice, a very grief-filled, difficult wraparound service time of a transition from one state to an unending different state. We should be building dense, well-served by transit housing in safe places where people can go that will be affordable. And that really will be expensive. This is the most expensive and most difficult challenge humanity has ever faced. It's really enormous. And so when it comes to economics, I'm afraid I'm going to say both sides need a lot of support. And we've done well pushing towards a green economy and putting a lot of tax credits and incentives that direction. I think we also need to be shifting our attention to adaptation.
Very well said.
Oh,
I don't have a little bit to add. Just a little bit of context, historical context. For a long time, it was like taboo to talk about adaptation because it was seen as, we need to focus on reducing emissions. And if you start talking about adapting, people are going to think they don't have to reduce emissions. And so we can't talk about that. And that was a big mistake, I think, obviously, that people in the kind of climate world and energy world who were trying to make progress on this set up. And I think that a lot of climate activists and things should have some responsibility for this false binary that was set up for so long. And so now we're playing catch up. Like you said, so little money goes to this. Two things. One is that I think that one of the incentives in this sort of economic transformation that I think is really important does not get underscored enough. I've been writing about climate change for 25 years. People say, why aren't you an alcoholic living in your basement, scrawling on the wall with crayons about the fate of civilization? And sometimes I am, but usually I come out, shave, go to events like this. But it's because I really do think that of all the, I know it's hard to listen to us all here talk about this, and it seems so overwhelming and so kind of scary and dark, but I think it's really important, especially from this economic point of view, to remember that this is a moment of opportunity, that this is a moment where we are going to change everything about our world. We're going to change how we get energy, we're going to change how we get food, we're going to change how we build cities, we're going to change everything. And it's a real opportunity for better. And so I think that one of the tools for sort of dealing with this economically is building better and thinking about this, these kind of renovation that we have to do to our world, make it more appealing and make it more valuable. And just one last thing, and if that fails, there's always lawsuits. And the City of Charleston is engaged in a lawsuit against the fossil fuel companies saying, hey, your product caused this problem. You knew about it for a long time. You need to help us pay for this. And, Susan's better to talk about the nuances of that if anybody wants to talk about it, but that is a sort of avenue that is, as far as I know, 3 or 4 years ago, there weren't many of these suits, and now there's a whole lot of them. So I don't know where that will all end, but I think that that's something that's changing the political mix a little bit right now, too.
Thank you. Another question?
Hello?
I just want to say that I'm terrified that there's only one of you up there on the stage being paid by a government. And I want to know what our counties are going to be doing that live all around us and all over the country, because we can't, you've got a very large soul and a very good brain, but you can't hold the dike all by yourself. That worries me.
So thank you for that. So, federalism, which is at the heart of our Constitution, makes the collaboration we need, the efficiency in investment, the efficiency in policy, efficiency in delivery, really difficult. The framers did a great thing with federalism, but boy, it gets in the way of this collaboration and this adaptation. That said, when I came here, again, I've worked in Houston and New Orleans and New York and Miami and all these other places, and I've sort of learned like what works and what doesn't, and I have my own opinions about some of this, but it's very clear to me that the City of Charleston has a bit of a leadership position in the state on this issue. First city in the state to adopt the Climate Action Plan, and we're doing good stuff with it. So we're working on the mitigation and the adaptation side. But we weren't collaborating with our friends in North Charleston, and we weren't collaborating with the folks over in Mount Pleasant, even though they're downstream of us as the water comes in, right? So as the water comes in from the ocean, they've got the problem too. What can we do together? And Mount Pleasant has almost a real similar problem to the city of Charleston, just less dense, right? So what are we doing here? And what about the county? Because there's a lot of space, there's a lot of parcels in the city of Charleston that aren't the cities, they're the counties, right? So we have this problem. So Katie McCain and I, the Sustainability Director, we have started to drive some collaboration with Mount Pleasant, with North Charleston, with the county, and with the BCD COG, the regional planning organization. And we have been invited we submitted a great letter, and NOAA has invited us to make a full application for a regional water plan for the Tri-County. So we're driving it, right? Katie has taken her composting and our recycling and a few other things. She has now brought a whole bunch of the other communities into that process. So we're driving the regional collaboration, and it's wonderful. So this area has the first, second, and fourth largest cities in the state of South Carolina. We're providing a lot of revenue upstate, right, through all this activity. Maybe if we sort of stand together more solidly vis-a-vis Columbia, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but sometimes we may need some attention too, right? So that'll help us do that. So this regionalism is really important, that it isn't just the governments that need to collaborate. In our sea level rise strategy, we talk about our partnerships. The Historic Charleston Foundation co-funded and helped lead the Dutch dialogues, right, with us. Faith, Historic Charleston Preservation Society, they sort of forced a bigger discussion on Union Pier. The Preservation Society is developing resilience standards for reconstruction of historic buildings. The medical district is saying, we'll help you all do these things. The Citadel, so there are a lot of non-governmental parties that are part of the solution, and we need to reel them all in or bring them all together. And as the Dutch say, get all the noses pointed in the same direction, because that's how we're going to do it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dale.
I'm sure there are many people that would have liked to ask questions in the audience, but I think it's good to end the session while you were all laughing. I'd like to thank all the panel members. It's been an extremely thought-provoking and very... And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for embracing the conversation. Jeff and Susan will be signing their books in the foyer. And thank you once again, particularly to Henry, for keeping us all in order.